Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another Fuds on Film podcast. My name is Scott Morris and I'm joined today by Drew Davendale.
Hola.
And just to continue our series of incredibly happy, life-reaffirming films, we've decided to take a look at Birth of a Nation in both the 1915 and 2016 flavours. So you know you're in for a fun ride with those two.
It's going to be a laugh riot.
A hoot is what it will be.
Booja basha, booja basha. And if anyone actually gets that reference, please tell us, because we'll be very, very genuinely delighted.
Answers on a postcard. So shall we just dive straight into the joys of Birth of a Nation in 1915 and just get it over with? I'd always wondered what the silent movie title card equivalent of I'm not racist but was. D W Griffiths rides to the rescue on that score.
I am pleased that that's the phrase you used, because that was exactly, in my mind, its title card is basically straight out of the 1915 version of the Daily Mail. It's, I am not racist, but absolutely is that.
But I suppose we should place the film in the time of its creation, which was, as I mentioned, space year 1915. Still very much the infancy of the Hollywood film industry, which, if you'll permit a gross simplification, largely consisted of the comedy pratfalls of the likes of Chaplin and Arbuckle, or the powerhouse that was Cecil B. DeMille. 14 directorial credits in 1915, including 9 of the top-grossing films of the year. Europe, of course, had other concerns during this time frame. The top-grossing film in 1915, however, was the groundbreaking Birth of a Nation, a 3-hour-long adaptation in an era where less substantial one-hour films were the norm, inasmuch as there was a norm for any of this cinema malarkey. DeMille's Carmen, which was the second top-grossing film of 1915, took about $150,000, which is a nice return in 1915 money. And while the accounting for this is obtuse due to the way it was distributed, estimates place Birth of a Nation as taking somewhere between $10 and $100 million. Orders of magnitude more, and adjusted for inflation well into the range of today's blockbuster take. So, well kent, as you may say. Now, you may have noticed I've glossed over what this was an adaptation of. The Klansman, also the film's original title, ought to be setting alarm bells ringing, but particularly given the subtitle A Historical Romance of the Ku Klux Klan, so not a Highlander fanfic, sadly.
No, nor something set in the pub and still game.
The first half of the film covers the American Civil War itself, and ignoring certain very large aspects, which we'll get to, is barely reprehensible at all, comparatively. It's focusing on two respected families whose younger scions are friendly with each other, the Stonemans in the north and the Camerons in the south, who will soon find themselves on opposite sides of the Civil War. This in particular would threaten the possible relationship between Henry Walthall's Colonel Ben Cameron and Lillian Gish's Elsie, daughter of the Honourable Austin Stoneman, leader of the House, and barely veiled Thaddeus Stevens surrogate. Now, I'm no expert in the era, but it seems uncontroversial enough to state that in terms of filmmaking scale and technique, this was a leap forward. With a then huge production budget, this managed to show large-scale scenes, in particular battle sequences, that were a far cry from the usual closer to filmed plays that were still common. It's also an early showing for things taken for granted today, things like close-ups and the bespoke score, and in this respect, it's argued, this still makes the film relevant today. Now, perhaps the most immediately obvious thing I've glossed over so far is the extensive use of blackface. White actors made up to look black, with extremely limited success.
Which is to say, none.
Yes. And it's not like it was alone in using this, and it's still depressingly widespread use until fairly recently. The Black and White Minstrel Show was still being run on the BBC till the mid-70s or something like that, and even then it's not like it was reviled at the time, it was still drawing in pretty good crowds.
Yes, the 70s was a bad time. You think about things like, wasn't the 70s when Love Thy Neighbour was on?
Yes.
That sort of thing, and was a bad time here, and that's here where things weren't ever quite so bad as they were in the United States. So.
And I don't think any modern audience, however, is going to disagree that this was a reprehensible practice. So while there is a school of thought that you shouldn't hold any artefact of the time that was made responsible for the norms of that time, I don't hold with that school, and anyway, given the content of the film, it's uniquely appalling here. Try and imagine watching this as an African-American, with their portrayal here, and being told through the casting choices that we don't even think an African-American could convincingly live up to these low standards. And, Jesus, what low standards they are. The very few slaves that you might want to argue are seen in anything approaching a positive light are essentially happily subservient Uncle Toms, e.g. credited as Mammy the Faithful Servant. And while anyone black or white with the temerity to suggest that human beings are born equal and ought to be treated as such is shown as a monster, almost literally in the case of George Siegmund's Silas Lynch, the mulatto lieutenant governor as the credits would have it. The second half of the film, set after the assassination of Lincoln by the coward Robert Ford at Dealey Plaza, sees Stoneman and his radical buddies take control of the government agenda and force through harsher terms on the slave states. With the softly approach out of the window, Lynch starts orchestrating a power grab, encouraging black voters to vote for black candidates, almost as though they're real people or something, marginalising those poor white people who find their former possessions in a surprisingly unforgiving mood. Soon, feeling oppressed and threatened by this turn of events, and on a personal level, Ben Cameron's worries about Lynch's designs on his squeeze Elsie Stoneman, Cameron creates the KKK to defend his oppressed minority, and eventually intimidate black voters into not voting under the threat of death. Land of the free, and the home of the brave. This film's attitude is perhaps best encapsulated by the intertitle: The former enemies of North and South are united again in defence of their Aryan birthright.
There is no positive way to use the word birthright.
Yes.
It's always negative, and it's particularly glaring in that card that comes up, let alone the use of the word Aryan.
Textbook white supremacist language, and frankly, even if we were going to take on face value this film's account of the horrors of the Reconstruction from the white perspective, it's still nothing that's going to excuse the goddamned KKK. The film, of course, takes time out to make sure that any white people that sympathise with the blacks is also seen as a coward or a hypocrite, Stoneman in particular, but it's the portrayal of black people that really makes this a real treat for bigots. It shows them as barely removed from beasts, and I think that's understating it. It is jaw-droppingly offensive on every level in ways that I don't think we even really need to elucidate on. We've not moved on anywhere like enough on race relations in the last 100 years, but I think the one thing we've all settled on is that this is some completely indefensible garbage. Well, at least in terms of its narrative of Reconstruction-era black-bashing, clan-lauding horsemanure. The question of its technical worth, I suppose, still remains. For my money, any lessons that this could teach have been taken, refined and expanded on so much that they're not worth learning anymore than if you were going to learn computer programming, you wouldn't spend your time looking at a very elegant series of punched cards as anything other than a curiosity. Perhaps you could level the same point at something like Citizen Kane and at least hear that argument, but Citizen Kane still has a great story that, as a small bonus, isn't stupendously racist. Even if you are better at separating the technique from the content than I am, I'd still contend there's nothing of value here in terms of storytelling that you couldn't get from less offensive films, or plays, or novels, and the more technical aspects, while groundbreaking for the time, would like be looking at a George Méliès film as an instructional tool for 3D rendering software. It has been left behind and does not deserve to be dredged up in the modern era as anything other than a cautionary tale. Despite what Griffiths' title cards would have us think, that is not an argument for censorship. It is just not engaging with an argument that very obviously has no worth to it. No platform this film, my fellow snowflakes.
Yes, this film, which I had been curious about for a number of years. One of those films that I felt at some point in my life I'd be compelled to watch, not for the purposes of entertainment, more as a curiosity, certainly a historical document. Not in the same way that, and I have tried once to read it and never tried again, but may do at some point in the future. I did try once to read Mein Kampf for the purposes of that. The person that wrote that book having had such a dire impact in the world, I kind of thought it would be interesting, at least intellectually, to kind of understand the thoughts. Obviously, I'm not going to agree with them, but to understand that. Whereas The Birth of a Nation doesn't really have that.
No.
Because it falls in more, and again, this was something else that I watched in the same way that I watched this many, many years ago now, but The Eternal Jew. And those films share something in that they are just the most ridiculous propaganda. And they're so ridiculous, so patently ridiculous and so over the top that for a lot of it, I was expecting to be deeply, deeply, deeply offended by this. And it's just so ludicrous that I actually, for most of it, couldn't find myself being offended. I mean, it's horrible and ridiculous. But it was just so daft, quite frankly, that anybody could believe this nonsense.
Yeah.
So I didn't actually feel quite as dirty and uncomfortable watching this as I expected, simply because it was just so crazy. It really, particularly with the way the slaves are portrayed and the ones with the really, really terrible makeup, the way they're portrayed is like one step shy of the way that Jews are portrayed with horns. I like that bit at the start of Borat with the running of the Jews.
Yeah.
It's almost on that level of ludicrousness with the portrayal of black people as, I'm not even sure how you would put it, primitives maybe. It's just so ridiculous. Which is not to say that I wasn't offended by a great deal of it, just not as much as I expected, because everything about it was just so stupid. Now, so yeah, from that point of view of being like a historical curiosity, then I suppose it was interesting enough to watch, though I am definitely not going to recommend that most people do that. Whereas it do back to my point of something like Mein Kampf, which is actually, I think, to understand 20th century history, may actually be a useful thing to read. I don't think you're going to understand an awful lot about history from watching this film, other than that for this film to be that popular, the stereotypes in this film must have been, if not widely held, at least widely believed after watching it, which makes me genuinely worry, and not for the first time, about the credulousness and the intellectual capacity of the general public. It is, though, honestly, rather than talk about the nature of the film, the contents rather, I'm going to talk more about it technically, and actually, in many regards, it's a pretty terrible film. It's like you mentioned with Citizen Kane, Scott. Citizen Kane was a groundbreaking technical film, but has this very, very compelling story and great performances, whereas the acting in The Birth of a Nation is almost universally awful, which really surprised me. I didn't have any preconception at all about what the performances would be like, but there is, with the exception maybe of the Thaddeus Stevens analogue, Stoneman, with the exception of him, everybody's almost like, I don't know, somebody from a pantomime or worse. It's terrible. Like, for instance, the little sister of the Camerons. The original girl that plays her when she's younger is kind of just there. But then the woman that plays her when she grows up a little seems to be perpetually amused in every scene. Like, I'm hiding in a basement and I'm smiling and laughing all the time.
Particularly given what she was hiding in the basement from in that particular scene. I know there's always a certain lack of subtlety in these silent works, but still.
Yeah, and then the mulatto housekeeper of Stoneman with her terrible makeup on. And for as much as the makeup that makes the eyes more prominent, the most ridiculous wide-eyed gurning straight to camera for every scene that she's in, and the whole film is full of that. So acting-wise, it's genuinely appalling. And yes, I know that they don't have dialogue, but it's just genuinely terrible. There are technical achievements in it, as you mentioned. I mean, the fact that it was such a phenomenally long film for the time is incredible, and the shots they've managed to get with movement, given how limited they were by film stock, by shutter speed, by the equipment, etc., and the location that they could go to. It's genuinely ambitious, and that's kind of impressive. So yeah, while technically ambitious and competent, or beyond competent really, and to make a 3-hour, 50-minute film in 1915 with all of those action scenes and so many people and the movement, people on horses and things. Yeah. Clearly, Griffith was a skilled filmmaker. Wasn't an artist though, because there's basically about 2 artful scenes in the whole film. I mean, again, limited by what you can do, I guess, with camera movement and camera placement, but so much of it is just so static, may be the word. Certainly very perfunctory.
But the art of the dolly was not quite invented for something with cameras those size, though, was it?
But you can look back at other films like, from the time, and I'm glad you mentioned Georges Méliès, because I was going to mention him. Méliès' films, while they don't stand up now technically, and possibly not even storytelling-wise, Méliès' films undeniably have both art and charm.
Oh, yeah.
So you absolutely can watch them now and appreciate them, whereas visually there's not really much enjoyable to look at in The Birth of a Nation. So as just an entertaining film, if you look careful with the word entertaining, because of its content, but artistically, it's a bit of a bum note. It strikes a bit of a bum note. There's not an awful lot there artistically. Historically, it's the effects of the film that are important rather than what it covers, because it's just such a skewed, ridiculously skewed, in fact, version of the events of the Reconstruction era, to the point where I again genuinely worry about the intellectual capabilities of people watching this. Yeah, so artistically, it's a big fat zero, this film. Technically, yes, impressive, but what makes this film interesting is that it was so insanely popular. I say, or literally orders of magnitude, even on the lower end of the estimates for how much money it really made, orders of magnitude more successful than any of its peers. But it's the fact that this film gave rise to basically the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan and massive aggression and violence against black people as a result, as well as also Griffith himself making a film the next year called Intolerance that was all about, oh, these people didn't respond well to my film.
Yeah.
Oh, he's all butthurt because people didn't agree with the nonsense in his propaganda film.
The strange thing is, right, we were talking earlier about that title card, the disclaimer that you had up front.
Yeah.
If you've got there, could you read that out? Because what struck me as strange when I was looking at that title card and also the things that he was saying after it is that it's almost as though Griffiths thought he was being protested against because he was showing the Civil War. It's like he was, I need to be allowed to show that war is hell, but it seems to be effectively what he's saying. But that is not why people were upset about his film. I wonder if he was actually just wrong about that.
And also,
he's
it's
got the wrong end of the stick.
It's not something that his film shows in any way. And if you remind me, Scott, because I'd like to come back to the war afterwards, because you've just reminded me of something I wanted to talk about with the film. That yes, a plea for the art of the motion picture. We do not fear censorship, for we have no wish to offend with improprieties or obscenities, but we do demand, as a right, the liberty to show the dark side of wrong, that we may illuminate the bright side of virtue, the same liberty that is conceded to the art of the written word, that art to which we owe the Bible and the works of Shakespeare. Oh, he's so self-important, isn't he? Okay, then the next card goes on to say, if in this work we have conveyed to the mind the ravages of war to the end that war may be held in abhorrence, this effort will not have been in vain. Yes, because the abhorrence of war was entirely the point of your film.
You see what I mean? It just sounds like he's... And surely it can't have been. I think everyone was quite clear about what was upsetting about this even at the time, but it seems like he's far more concerned about being... Oh, you can't criticise war, but we're not criticising war, we're criticising the way that you've shown black people, you crazy mofo.
It's not good. It's not good at all. I can't find a particular card just now, but there's a card too about, and we don't want to show any race in any particular bad way, but the suggestion of I'm not racist, but yes, these were the way these primitive black people were like. Yes. To go back to the film, and what I wanted to mention earlier, and I'd forgotten to make the point, said this is a 3 hour 50-minute film, which was ambitious technically at the time. I can't work out why it's 3 hours 15 minutes though, because it basically takes 3 hours 50 minutes to barely tell a story. Because actually there isn't all that much of a story in it, and I don't understand why it takes them so long, especially because the first almost an hour and a half covers elements of the American Civil War, and it's largely irrelevant to how the rest of the story goes.
Yeah. You
could have had one card that said the brothers were friends and then found themselves on opposite sides, cut to Reconstruction era.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, I did think too that the knowledge about the war would have been more in the mind in 1915, it being just 50 years after the end of the war. Still, 50 years is a long time. The fact that it just assumes so much knowledge about the events of the American Civil War kind of struck me as odd, because there's one card comes up and it's a conqueror marches to the sea, and like, well, that was about Sherman going through the south to Georgia and eventually to Atlanta, but it doesn't actually mention that, so it's relying on people knowing that, and I just wonder how, certainly now I think that knowledge isn't hugely well known, that people wouldn't understand that referred to Sherman.
Yeah, so, I didn't know it was Sherman. I mean, I knew the general gist of the way the advance went, but as to who was that particular... Yeah,
no, so the conqueror marches to the sea was definitely about Sherman, and his march through Georgia, but why they just assumed that knowledge is strange, especially given it took so long to not tell anything else. Nothing much is happening there.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a strange film for something that had such a powerful effect. As a story, it fails. It fails acting-wise. It fails as a piece of art. It succeeds on a technical level, and that's it. So I just find it strange that, well, certainly to me, something that was so ineffectual was in fact in some ways so effective. For all that I said that I wasn't as offended as I thought, it's because, well, I'm not insane, and I don't think any of those portrayals of people or any of the ridiculous arguments they make are in any way in the same universe as approaching valid, but so I wasn't as offended as I expected to be. It's still a massively offensive film. It's horrible. And it basically has no redeeming features. And as Scott said earlier, there's very little merit even beyond just it being some sort of historical curiosity in watching this.
Yeah.
Which is good, I suppose, because I don't really want this to have any power or relevance. anymore, but for something considered a cinematic classic, it's not. It really, really is not.
Yeah. Yeah, like as you say, it's just the cultural effects ran far deeper than anything that the film really deserves, and that's worth reading about. But it's not worth really subjecting yourself to the film, which is way too damned long and way too damned offensive to really have any
just way too
all.
damned bad also.
Yeah.
Yes, so that's what we've discovered. Well, it's a deeply offensive film. We discovered this titan of cinema. And it was, I don't think it was tremendously long ago, it was one of the films submitted to the National Library of Congress.
Yeah.
Which absolutely understandable, because films are selected on artistic merit or on cultural importance, and absolutely, given the effects it had, things like the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, then it deserves to be in there. But I just kind of assumed, foolishly apparently, that it would have had some sort of artistic merit as well.
Yeah.
But no, it doesn't.
Nope.
So yes, as Scott says, read about it and understand just that it's a very, very unpleasant thing, this film, and don't ever bother watching it. You will be wasting your time.
Yes.
Unless you're really, really interested in the history of cinema, then I wouldn't watch it. You can just read about it.
Yes.
So, will we jump forward a century, Scott?
Yes.
Okay then, so after D W Griffiths' The Birth of a Nation, 1915, director Nate Parker deliberately took the title of that hideous film for the title of his 2016 directorial debut. Griffiths' film provoked a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan and an increase in violence against black citizens. Parker hoped to have a similarly powerful effect, but with a much more positive influence. This, The Birth of a Nation, is a biopic, telling the relatively little-known story of Nat Turner, a slave preacher who led an uprising of his fellow slaves against their captors in Virginia in 1831. In an early scene, the boy Nat is marked out for glory, a prophet who would lead his oppressed people, something which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This journey begins when Nat steals a book and teaches himself to read, a feat which simply amazes Penelope Ann Miller's Elizabeth Turner, the wife of Nat's master. Elizabeth takes it upon herself to teach young Nat using the Bible. Years later, as an adult, we see him eventually become a preacher to his unfortunate fellows. The old Master Turner is dead, and his son Samuel, Army Hammer, once Nat's childhood playmate, is now in charge. Nat and Samuel's relationship appears reasonably genial, and it seems that Nat likes and even trusts Samuel. But after Nat is hired out to surrounding farms to preach calmness to their uppity slaves and quell fears of an uprising, he belatedly comes to the realization that there is no such thing as the good and kindly master. There is only evil, and less evil. Further abhorrent actions by Samuel and other slaveholders awakens purpose in Nat, and he begins to organise the slaves, who see him as their messiah. The end result is the Two-Day Rebellion, which saw the deaths of many white slaveholding families and the deaths of considerably more black people in retaliation. The Birth of a Nation is populated by singularly evil people for whom unspeakable acts of cruelty and barbarity are common, everyday, mundane. That matter-of-factness really magnifies the horror of what these slaves had to suffer. And the immense difficulty that the likes of Turner had in improving their lot. And those are amongst the most affecting moments in the film. Turner's deep knowledge of biblical scripture, ironically afforded him by his white jailers, leads to some satisfying scenes when he turns the slaveholders' own justifications for their positions against him. Though it's not at all clear if Turner, or indeed Parker, is aware of the ridiculousness of a book whose contradictions and hypocrisies allow it to be used both for and against the same thing. The acting throughout is at least competent and in some places strong. It's well shot. In fact, in many places it's beautiful, and that juxtaposition of picturesque landscapes in which true horror is perpetrated is affecting. But in many respects, it's uneven, and the visions are simply a distraction. And its climax is a bit too heroic, a bit too Braveheart. It is also very much a man's film, told from a man's perspective. The male slaves in birth may have very little agency, but the women have none, and their role is too often portrayed as a victim for the purposes of having a man seek revenge. It sadly also lacks room for much nuance or complication, though it does explore the crossover between religion and capitalism that was such an important part of the justification of the southern economy at the time. It's certainly interesting, and with the regular caveat of one requiring the ability to separate the art from the artist, it's something that I would recommend seeing. It is, in almost every way, a mainstream film, And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. But while it has some shocking moments, and a righteous anger, its ensconcement inside of the comfort of mainstream structure and storytelling, and its use of pretty much every attendant cliché, blunts its edge and robs it of power. Additionally, though Nat Turner's story is worthy of telling, and too little known, Parker's film is a contemporarily relevant polemic, but also a revenge film. And if you want to watch an antebellum era, revisionist revenge film, then your first stop should be Django Unchained, which, lack of historical basis aside, is the superior of this film in every conceivable way. Should you have time for two such films, though, then you could make The Birth of a Nation your second stop.
Yeah, I mean, the satisfying narrative for this episode demanded that this be a triumph, but reality does have a way of getting in the way of those plans, doesn't it?
It does indeed, yes.
Right, I mean, to be clear, I would rather watch this 100 times consecutively than watch The Birth of a Nation 1915 again. But yeah, I think primarily for me the problem with this film is the tone. It clearly, for a lot of the films, are going for this sort of sweeping, emotional, affecting story arc. You know, the score kind of backs that up, but particularly towards the final reels, as you mentioned, it's much closer to Django Unchained than 12 Years a Slave.
Yeah.
And it just feels, for want of a better term, cheesy.
That's why I particularly mentioned about this sort of mainstream structure and cliches, because it does use pretty much every cliche for that era and stories about slaves and things at the time, as well as just like a general middle of the road, middle brow drama of this type. It uses them all, and cheesy is a good word for a lot of it. And you mentioned the score too. It's quite didactic in places, that score. Yeah. And a lot of what's in it is entirely worthy of being told. It's just how it's been told I don't particularly like. But sorry, I'll let you continue.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what I was getting onto. It is very obvious in the way that it's trying to manipulate you. And look, every film's trying to do that to greater or lesser degree, but it seems most of them have a better way of hiding it than this does, which is very clearly trying to prompt you down certain directions where you should really be hitting there by yourself. And it just feels like a minor insult, a lot of it. I mean, it's a well put together film for the most part. It's got better than average performances. Parker himself does well, and Armie Hammer does much better than I would have expected when I found out that Armie Hammer was in it. But it's not quite the rallying cry that it thinks it is, and perhaps ought to have been. It's not bad, but as we've said for a lot of things, for a while this was being talked about as an Oscar contender. I cannot for the life of me see where that was coming from. No, it's not even the best film about slavery in the past few years, let alone of any greater time frame. It's just it's clearly substandard to 12 Years a Slave, and even Lincoln, and that wasn't even about slavery, really. Yeah, or even The Free State of Jones, which was sort of tangentially about that. That's a better film too. But 12 Years a Slave is powerful and raw, and there are moments in this that evoke that same sort of feeling someplace. But there is one scene which it's nigh on unwatchable, which is the scene where a slave is force-fed, who's on hunger strike. That was horrific. That's gruesome, isn't it? Yes, and it absolutely should be in there because, and it's what I mentioned earlier about how that sort of treatment has become mundane, and that's how it's even more evil and how bad it is, because that's just what they did to people without even thinking about it. But yes, the rest of it's very ordinary. It clearly thinks it's very special, and it's by no means a bad film, but it's not anything like as big or as clever as it believes itself to be. Yeah. I swither about whether to talk about these things, but you did kind of obliquely mention it there. And between that and the talking about the way that women are treated in this film, the allegations of Nat Parker that had been put forward, when I'd first heard about it, I thought it was kind of a bit overblown because he'd been on trial and acquitted, and I thought, well, that seems to be a due process served its purpose and so on, and I didn't see quite why he was being so beaten up about these sort of allegations of abuse. But then he himself was kind of went on and agreed that think there was more to it than was covered in that case, and as dutifully penitent as you would be in a PR for a junket for these kind of things, and it's clearly harmed this film and the reputation of himself and what the film had. Again, it's one of these things, can you separate the art from the artist in this respect? The question kind of gets ended around because I don't think this is actually all that good a film anyway. So it kind of took care of that by itself. But it's more difficult to separate art from the artist when the controversy of the artist is actually something that's at least touched upon in the art. You're at least verging on the realms of irony and hypocrisy. Yes. And also
because the thing that he was accused of is used as a tool for the storytelling. Again, very probably and factually based, but the women in this film are so ill-served because they are basically, the men are supposed to be free, the women are still property, except they're just supposed to be property of their husbands rather than property of the white slaveholders. Yeah, so when the film deals with what the issues of the artist are about too, and also because there's something sort of quite macho about some of the portrayals of the characters in this. Not strongly sort of say, but it's there, and Nate Parker has also said some completely ridiculous things too, like basically pretty much anti-gay by tone, if not by actual word, and saying that somehow, I don't know where he's getting this from, that black men in cinema are being emasculated. Shut up, you complete bell end.
He's not a fan of Moonlight, was he?
He's trying to be progressive in one way, but some of his other attitudes are distinctly stone-aged.
Yes.
When that does necessarily, and perhaps legitimately, colour your interpretation of that, particularly when, and for someone like, say, Roman Polanski, who's a strong director, but usually working off someone else's script, so his influence may be less. But when, in this case, Parker was the writer and the actor and the director and the producer. Yeah, so then it's like, you simply can't separate completely art from artist. It's going to colour your interpretation of it because it's clearly coloured the production. I don't know, it's always a very difficult issue to talk about, to get around there, because I don't know, because I think the argument comes down to, and this is in general rather than specifically about this film, but the argument comes down to, is seeing this film in some way condoning, or at least failing to condemn, or is it just like, well, no, you just keep it completely separate in your mind? That was a rather tricky thing to navigate.
Yeah, and I normally come down on the side of that. I try and separate it as much as possible, but it's, like you say, it's easier in cases where it's something like, I don't know, say Orson Scott Card, who I like a lot of his books, but the man himself, absolute totally. Yes,
he's a pillock, in the very mildest words I'll think of to use with him.
Yeah, but as you say, that's much easier to do when Orson Scott Card is some dude sitting in Arkansas or wherever he's from, and what he's writing about is some silly space opera, as opposed to something like this, where Nate Parker's far more, as you say, just far more interleaved into every aspect of it. A harder one to do in this case, and it's one of the tougher ones in a way that has never really bothered me in a way that, as you mentioned, like a Roman Polanski film or a Woody Allen film did. I've normally got other bones to pick with Woody Allen films rather than
any
of the variety he's got.
Absolutely, because Woody Allen is a little different in as much as that he generally writes his films too and acts in them, so he's more involved. But the topic of his films generally not got anything to do with the crimes of which he's been accused and the bad behaviour with which he's associated. Likewise, for the most part, Polanski, and he's more of just a director. But yeah, when you have somebody, in this case, you're so entwined with it, and it actually covers some of the topics that are at the root of the problem, and it becomes much less easy to separate the two.
So our definitive answer on this topic is yes.
Or possibly no.
Depending on how the question is phrased.
And indeed what the question is.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think I've really got a lot more to say about Birth of a Nation. I was genuinely hoping, perhaps I shouldn't have been, really, but I guess more for the narrative of this podcast, that it would be really good. And it's just, alright. And I can't really recommend anyone go out of the way to see it. Not that it's a bad film, but there are much better things dealing with this sort of subject, if not this exact one.
I think what we've discovered, Scott, is that between watching the 1915 The Birth of a Nation and the 2016 The Birth of a Nation, our recommendation is to watch Django Unchained by Quentin Tarantino.
Yes.
To be honest, I'm on board with that suggestion because I like that film a great deal. So. But it's a surprising recommendation, but there we go.
Yes, not who you suspected would win a head-to-head match, but there we go. We've compared and contrasted and found them both wanting. So
I suspect that I enjoyed this film a little more than you, but I think we're both fairly close to thinking it's okay as a film.
Yeah.
It has some merits, and certainly it has some problems, but it's past one in a way that the 1951 isn't.
Yes, exactly.
But I think we can both absolutely agree, completely undeserving of the ludicrous amounts of praise that came out of the Sundance Echo Chamber. last year.
Oh, yes.
It was not worthy of that at all. And I'm not sure why it was so highly lauded, but yeah, not deserving of that. I mean, maybe it's because there are relatively few films of this type dealing with this type of story. And certainly Nate Parker was dissuaded by many, many people from making a film about Nat Turner, saying that a mainstream film about a black slave leading a rebellion could not sell. And in the end, The Birth of a Nation ended up getting the biggest distribution deal that Sundance had ever seen.
Yeah.
And proving them wrong, although that was part of it, that narrative pleased people.
Yeah.
Film itself just isn't special. Not bad, but just not special.
Yeah, I agree.
So again, though, to sum up, The Birth of a Nation, watch a Tarantino movie.
Yes, watch Reservoir Dogs. That will wrap us up for this episode, which I guess wasn't quite as soul-destroying as last week's.
I'm quite pleased to find that I wasn't testing the structural integrity of my arterial walls in the way that, for instance, the Magdalene sisters made me do.
Yes. One bit of feedback on the last podcast from Blake Wrights of the I'm the Host podcast. Couldn't weigh in on the last one. He'd not seen any of the flicks, and well, as we mentioned, it's hard to really recommend a lot of those ones we spoke about either last time or here. But if you want another depressing life slice, the act of killing is both arresting and awful. Now, I've not seen that, and I really do want to get to it. I think we're planning a documentary episode at some point in the not too distant future, which it would certainly feature on that, I would hope. So, if you would like to get in touch with us at some point, we certainly encourage that. You could do so on the Twitters. It's at FuzzOnFilm, on Facebook, facebook.com/FuzzOnFilm, or through the emails. That's podcast@FuzzOnFilm.com. And that will wrap us up for now. We'll be back in another 10 days with some arbitrarily selected films from this month. But until that time, I have been Scott Morris, and Drew, you've been Drew.
I have, I can't deny it.
Yet you do. You do.
Goodbye.